aims were to do it quickly so they could release the troops needed to send them back to fight the war in China, so that they could grab those resources in the Netherlands East Indies and start shipping them back to Japan before the United States started to gear up for war.
December 7th, 1941. As Japanese aircraft were approaching Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita were already going ashore on the Malay Peninsula at Kota Baru.
Some of their early successes were all about simultaneous operations across a broad swathe of Asia and the Pacific. So the British and American forces in the Asia Pacific, they were spread out trying to react to the Japanese. A lot of these places were very weakly garrisoned as well, so the Japanese were very quickly seizing them and then moving on, because part of their battle plans were that troops required for one operation would then move relatively quickly on to the next. So they didn't have time to do that.
At the end of 1941, hardly more than 3 weeks after the code words Tora 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 had sent in the raid on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were now poised for a full-scale invasion of Burma, the conquest of the Philippines, the assault on Singapore, and the defeat of the Dutch in the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. As Churchill said of the fall of France, how could it have happened so quickly? The reasons for victory can be seen in the campaign in Malaya. They were repeated through the co-prosperity sphere and were fundamental to Japan's early success. When Japanese transports, more than 20 of them, brought Yamashita's army group ashore at 7 sites on December 8th, they were virtually unopposed. British forces were in their habitual deployment, particularly in strength around the Butterworth base, and had not been moved despite the growing threat of Japanese militarism and the presence of the Japanese force across the Gulf of Siam. The 5th Infantry Division quickly secured the air bases at Patani and Singora. Taking Singora, where the peninsula narrows, made possible the movement of Japanese forces across to the west coast. And that meant that Yamashita could advance on 2 fronts, dividing the defenders. The Japanese maintained flexibility in action. The east coast, thinly defended, was little more than a march southwards. The west coast required different tactics, and they got them. Hook actions either left strong defensive positions impotent in the wake of troops that had bypassed them, or more usually, encircled and smashed them. In places, these hooks meant moving through jungle that the British had deemed impassable, an echo of the French mistake that was exposed by the advance through the Ardennes.
The terrain is exploited by the Japanese in a way that it's not by the British. They never quite managed to work out how to prevent the Japanese outflanking, both using the forested areas, but also what the Japanese do in Malaya as well is make use of small craft to outflank British positions on the land by outflanking movements using the sea.
All the early reports from Malaya spoke of heavy and confused fighting with the Japanese gaining ground. This is typical Malayan country, almost the only place in which troops can deploy being the plantation.
The Japanese had been specifically trained in jungle warfare. The British and Commonwealth forces had not. Their strategy had suffered from traditional textbook planning which had, in a way, suffered from imperial hubris.
There's a lot of racial prejudice underlies the Allies' initial reading of what the Japanese military is capable of. And so it underestimates its ability to manoeuvre. It underestimates its ability to fight. It underestimates its willingness to utilise the terrain to its advantages. It underestimates the capabilities of its aircraft, and thus the Japanese are able to wrest control of the skies in areas that they're fighting very quickly.
Speed was fundamental to Japanese military thinking, so it was engineered into every aspect of the operation. Troops, not only in the Malay campaign, but everywhere and throughout the war, travelled with very little in the way of support. When, by the 21st of December, British formations received the order to concentrate on a line behind the Perak River, it was too late. Japan would continue to record victories, pushing and pushing faster than their opponents could recover, so that Singapore, the Philippines, and the East Indies would all fall. If there was a true Blitzkrieg in the Second World War, it was this one. In a matter of weeks, Japan had gained for itself 1/6 of the surface of the planet.
It seems for a while that you have this superhuman enemy, this soldier who can keep going and going, who fights like the devil, who doesn't fight the way that Western forces expect to fight. It also means that there's a vast amount of territory that, if the Allies are going to win the war, that they have to recapture from the Japanese.
But after 6 months, the seeming invincibility of Japan was stopped in a great naval battle in a place called Midway. The United Kingdom's position as a great power, which she possessed at the start of the Second World War, was not a consequence of the wealth or weather or natural resources of the British Isles. It rested on her empire, a vast maritime empire, the greatest the world had known. And the integrity of that empire rested not on a large standing army, it depended on the Royal Navy.
The Royal Navy, facing only Germany before the fall of France, was a dominant force and continued to have the strategic advantage of effectively sitting astride Germany's exits to the globe.
It had 8 major groups located in the Atlantic at the time that the Germans could barely deploy 2 battle cruisers and a number of submarines.
Before the war began, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee sailed for the South Atlantic, and there she waited.
Chief interest, of course, attaches to the famous pocket battleships, which are only 10,000 tons, but mount 6 11-inch guns and have a speed of 26 knots.
Once war had started, the Graf Spee began her operations. Between the end of September and the end of October, she sank 6 vessels in an area that straddled a major sea lane for ships, travelling around the Cape of Good Hope.
Well, the Graf Spee was in the South Atlantic as part of a deliberate campaign to interrupt, to destroy the global shipping movements, to slow and interrupt the movement of resources to and from the United Kingdom.
By November, the Royal Navy had formed 6 task forces to find and sink the battleship. In early December, Graf Spee claimed 2 more victims. But they did not go down without sending radio signals that influenced Commodore Harwood, commanding Force G, to concentrate his forces on the Falkland Islands. Captain Langsdorff, commanding Graf Spee, made 2 blunders. The first was that, spotting the smoke of 4 of Harwood's cruisers and mistaking them for destroyers on escort duty, he closed to the attack. What followed, history knows as the Battle of the River Plate.
Captain Langsdorff of the Graf Spee, it was his duty not to engage British warships. It was his duty to preserve that ship undamaged. As soon as he detected British ships, he should have tried to go in the opposite direction.
Langsdorff engaged Exeter and Ajax, Royal Navy, and Achilles, Royal Navy, New Zealand Division. As soon as he realised his mistake, he sped towards the enemy to prevent them from outpacing him. Graf Spee had diesel engines, the British vessels steam, which could not accelerate rapidly. Graf Spee engaged Exeter at 17,000 metres at 0618. She had turned northwest against the Germans' approach.
Harwood actually split the cruisers, so they came at Langsdorff from 2 directions. which unnerved him a bit.
Ajax and Achilles, turning together northeast, forced Langsdorff to spread his fire. After 2 minutes, Exeter was returning fire, but Graf Spee had far superior weaponry.
In fact, it inflicted quite significant damage on the 3 British cruisers, which were undergunned compared to the 11-inch guns that he had. They had 8 and 6-inch guns.
By 0630, Ajax and Achilles had closed to 12,000 metres, forcing the German gunners to divide their main armament. After nearly an hour, Admiral Graf Spee was finished, far from out of the fight, still sailing and seaworthy, but done for, because a shell from Exeter, herself badly damaged and soon to retire from the battle, had damaged the battleship's fuel plant. Graf Spee now had fuel for only 16 hours sailing, which meant she could not get home. Neither could the damage be repaired at sea. Langsdorff consulted the charts. He would head for the nearest neutral port, and that was Montevideo at the mouth of the River Plate.